So the phrase literary inbreeding is just fun to say.
That's weird.
It's strange to hear, certainly, but it's fun to say. I don't know if anyone else has ever really used this phrase before. The first time I remember hearing it was way back in like 2017 or 2018, not long after I first started this channel. And basically, I used to have a friend who, her and I would send each other weird stories we found on the internet, either fanfiction or original ones that we just thought were funny. And while we were doing this, we noticed that a lot of these were written in kind of the same way. They had the same prose, they used the same repetitive tropes, they had the exact same style of humor, and I realized that this was probably happening because many of the writers who were making these things were really only consuming other online stories. They weren't reading actual books that much. And so I said, okay, these people are victims of literary inbreeding. Now, inbreeding in biology is what happens when closely related organisms reproduce, and basically it causes recessive genes to surface, and that will cause health problems as well as some other issues. I don't think I need to go into a lot of the details about inbreeding in this video, but that is basically what I'm referring to. And when I say literary inbreeding, I'm referring to people who pretty much only ever read one exact, very specific type of story and don't branch outside that, and so it causes the same problems. And this goes for all types of art, I think. If you're only ever consuming one very narrow type of art, one very, very specific type, then anything you create is going to be that, but it is going to suffer from a lot of these recessive traits that aren't supposed to really be noticeable, but they become more and more noticeable over time if that's all you make, or excuse me, if that's all you consume. Like, you need variety, otherwise you lose perspective, is another way of wording it. So basically, something that happens with fanfiction a lot is that people just write it because, yeah, we want to write romance, which a lot of fanfiction is romance or just erotica. I would venture so far as to say the majority of fanfiction is just romance, because you're taking these characters that you and the audience already know, you don't really have to bother developing them in any way, and you just put them into this scenario and they're in love, or they're falling in love now. And that works great for fanfiction, but the problem is people who primarily consume that and primarily write that tend to forget when they start writing something original that it's not fanfiction, and you do need to develop these characters if you want us to care about their romance. A lot of terrible TikTok books do this, and by TikTok books I mean books that got popular over there, where they just sort of throw in two characters who have no personality and then say, oh, but it's enemies to lovers, or oh, it's bully romance, and like, okay, that's fine, I guess, but what else is there? Who are these people? Why are you just taking these two randos and throwing tropes in my face? A lot of people who get their start in either fanfiction or other online fiction communities also seem to be forgetting that you're not writing 1 week at a time anymore. Because usually with these online stories, they're updated once a week or once every month or something like that. And so you're just coming up with it as you go, and you can't go back and edit anything. And, there's an art to doing that well, obviously, but it is different than writing a book, because when you write a book, you write the whole thing, you go back and edit and change however much you need, and then you just give it out all at once, and it's already completed. So being able to do both of those things well, like, they're different. Anyways, literary inbreeding is something that I really only noticed in fanfiction and online stuff for a long time, but in the past, 5 years, I've started to see it come into traditional publishing as well. I mentioned that bad TikTok books, specifically bad TikTok romantasy books, are kind of all the same. That's part of why I didn't want to talk about them that much for a while, but then the past couple months I decided, why not? The audience wants it, so I'll keep reading it. But they're kind of all the same. Part of that is laziness, yes, but as more time goes on, I think literary inbreeding is an even bigger part of it than laziness. Like, the authors who are writing this stuff never really read outside this very, very narrow niche. And so they start to think to themselves, like, yes, this is how it's done. And it never even occurs to them to try anything outside that very narrow niche. It's always going to be horny, if not just outright erotica. It's always going to be fairies, because apparently no other magical creatures exist. The main character is always going to be a young woman in her late teens or early 20s. She's always going to just sort of have the best powers, and most of the time she'll just know how to use them. Like, you know, these things are not common due to laziness or even really because that's what the audience demands. I think for a lot of these authors, they just haven't read anything outside that, and they forget that there's more things you can do, especially with fantasy. Fantasy has a lot of variety. You know, compare stuff like Mistborn to Orconomics or the Broken Empire trilogy or A Song of Ice and Fire. You know, these are all definitely fantasy, and they're all good, at least in my opinion, they're all good, but they're all very, very different from each other in terms of plot structure, tone, the types of characters you see in there. They're a lot different. Originally, young adult fantasy came around because you had authors that were taking elements from fantasy, from the stories they liked, and they were combining it with stuff from a younger audience. You know, and that's not something they could do if they exclusively read YA or if they exclusively read fantasy. Like, they had to be able to draw from all these different traditions and combine them in a new, interesting way. And even romantasy, while I do hate it as a genre, it also came around in a similar way, because people basically took young adult fantasy and then combined that with elements from just straight up erotica and adult romance. And that originally, you know, again, it's not my cup of tea. I don't like it very much, but at least when it started, it was created by people who had clearly read in a variety of different genres, and they decided to combine them. But the thing is, these authors aren't taking ideas from anything else anymore. They're just kind of copying each other ad nauseum, and as a result, we are getting literary inbreeding. It's not just that it's the same shit over and over again, it's that it's the same shit over and over again, but they're forgetting why that shit was there in the first place, and now the problems that weren't there originally, or were there but not really noticeable, are now kind of the central theme of these stories. It wasn't that long ago that I read Zodiac Academy, and in that video, which you should go watch if you haven't, I specifically say that the world building is almost impressively lazy. Like, it feels like the authors have never read fantasy before, and yeah, I'm pretty sure they really haven't. But originally in romantasy, that wasn't really a problem. You know, like if you go back again 5-10 years to when this first started taking off, and I'm aware Zodiac Academy first came out 6 years ago, but it wasn't the first romantasy book, it was just one of the first popular ones. But if you go back to the stuff that Zodiac Academy is clearly trying to ape, those did have at least some effort put into the world building. You know, the setting was an actual place. They tried explaining how magic worked and stuff, and okay, they weren't great necessarily, but they were trying, and then Zodiac Academy comes along and decides that because it's just copying those things where world building was there, but it wasn't really that important, Zodiac Academy suddenly has no world building. You know, like that's probably the best example I can think of. And just in case you think I'm singling out romantasy, I'm not. This sort of thing happens with other genres too. For example, The Critical Drinker writes a lot of really bad thrillers. I have a video on one of those, and I'm working on another. This is Dark Harvest, you can see. I am like 10% of the way through, little over 10% of the way through, and it's clear from reading his bad thrillers that this guy is only emulating movies. Like, he's straight up not even emulating other thriller novels that he likes, because I don't know if he reads that many. He's just emulating movies, and as a result, he is focusing entirely on stuff that would theoretically look cool on camera, but he's completely missing what makes thrillers work when they're books. Like, he's completely seeming to not understand that these are different art forms which work in different ways. Or think back to when Twilight was really huge and there were paranormal romance books all over the place, particularly young adult paranormal romance, and they were all kind of copying Twilight, but after a certain point they also just seemed like they were copying each other. But even when they were all copying each other and they were all following kind of the same formula, the authors back then all clearly loved reading, and they seemed to be taking inspiration from a variety of different places. They were just, you know, taking all that inspiration and fitting it into the same mold every time. But again, like, I've read too many of these for some reason. They are at least a little bit different from one another usually. For example, Nevermore, which I read just a couple months ago, that references Edgar Allan Poe a lot. And brings him into the story and brings his stories into the story. And like, it doesn't work that well, in my opinion, but it's clear that the author did really like Edgar Allan Poe, and she wanted to use some of that stuff that she loved as inspiration for her own writing. And again, it could have worked better, but she was trying, which I don't think that would really happen today. You know, if that was written today, you can look at the acknowledgments that authors write at the beginning, and sometimes they'll write stuff that they took inspiration from. And I believe it was with Blood of Hercules just a couple of months ago, people were sharing screenshots of that. And the author had listed off like a bunch of movies and anime and video games and stuff that she took inspiration from. Not a whole lot of books were there. And I'm willing to bet that if she did list some books that she had read, it would mostly just be other romantasy trash that was popular on TikTok. Yes, I'm probably going to try and read Blood of Hercules at some point this year. It's going to be a while, but I'll try and read it.
Why? Why?
Or look at the Sirena Legacy, which, like, those books aren't great, but they are a little bit different than other paranormal romance that was coming out around that time. You know, I read those almost a year ago now, and I still remember them pretty well, even though, again, they weren't that good, just because they do break the mold in a couple of interesting ways. For example, the final conflict in the last book is resolved peacefully. Okay, that's a little bit different. Like, it's, again, nothing too crazy or out there, but I kind of liked that the author was clearly trying, and she was clearly bringing in ideas and inspiration that she got from other genres. If she had just been reading other Twilight clones that were coming out at that time, then she would have probably not had the conflict resolved peacefully at the end. She would have had some big final battle like everyone else was doing, and then it would have been generic happily ever after. I think a big part of what causes literary inbreeding, because this has always been a thing to some extent, but I think a big part of what's causing it to become a much bigger issue these days is that the internet has made it way too easy to curate all the media you consume. Like, not just books, but all media, period. Like, that's why we have so many people who are going, hey, I want to read a slow burn enemies to lovers chosen one romance in a fantasy backdrop. Like, you know, they need all of those very, very specific things to happen, otherwise they're not reading, and they actively get mad at you because they're so used to getting everything they want exactly the way they demand it, that when they get any sort of surprise at all, they just don't know how to deal with it. And that's kind of upsetting to me, because being surprised is half the fun. You know, I've had a lot of good times over the years because I either turned on a movie and it was different than I was expecting, or I read a book and it wound up being different than I expected. Like, being surprised is half the fun, guys. You're not a toddler. Try something new. And I saw a post a couple of weeks ago, which was a joke about how, in order to foster empathy, men should read one novel every month about getting fucked by a werewolf, and women should read one sci-fi fantasy thing about a guy who is cool. And unironically, I do think that would teach people about other people. You know, it would help us understand how other groups of people think. I do unironically believe that. But also, it would be nice if people did that sort of thing because it would help avoid literary inbreeding. You know, and that's basically how I'm going to end this. Like, if you're a writer, or even if you're not, even if you're just a reader, try and get outside of your comfort zone. Branch out, man. Like, if you pretty much just read romantasy, then try reading regular fantasy. You know, try reading some of those ones I mentioned earlier, but also try reading stuff like Wheel of Time, for instance, or The Demonata. You know, The Demonata is still basically young adult, but it is a lot different than young adult fantasy stuff that's coming out these days. Or go even farther outside of your comfort zone. Start reading stuff by like Tom Clancy or David Weber. Read Island in the Sea of Time. Those books are interesting, and they're not perfect, but I do really like them, and it's hard to think of something more polar opposite than modern TikTok romantasy than Island in the Sea of Time. If the opposite is true, and you primarily read like thrillers, you know, if you read Jack Reacher and stuff, then try reading some of the better examples of weird TikTok romance. You know, try reading Lights Out. I read that a couple of months ago. That book was not amazing, not really my cup of tea, but I could at least see what it was going for, and I had some fun with it. If you primarily read stuff that's aimed at adults, try some stuff aimed at younger readers once in a while. You know, try reading Shatter Me, which those books aren't great, but again, that's something a little different. Or try reading The Young World. Because even if you're not the target audience for something, you can still get something out of it. I read tons of books for this channel, which I'm not in the target audience for, but I can still appreciate when they're doing what they're trying to do well versus doing it poorly. Look, fundamentally, art is just a variety of different ways in which we can communicate ideas to one another. Because communicating with other people is hard, sometimes words alone won't do it, and we need to create something a bit more complex in order to get our thoughts and feelings across. Like, ultimately, that's what all art is for. And if you're only ever consuming art where you already know exactly what it's going to be like, because it's exactly like all of the other art you're consuming, then you are really missing out on a big part of what it means to be a human being. I'm not trying to be too weird about that, but I feel like you're really missing out on a lot of stuff. Whatever your preference is, you should get outside that preference once in a while. And especially if you are a creator of art. If you're an actual writer or something, literary inbreeding should not be something that you worry about. But it is a thing that a lot of people suffer from. Goodbye. Ahoy! Thank you for watching this far. If you didn't watch this far but you still wound up here somehow, then I still appreciate you. You're great. All these names you see here, these are my patrons. You can go over to Patreon and pay $1 a month or more if you feel like it. Get access to stuff like one exclusive video every month, early access to videos, things of that nature. My $10 and up patrons are Arthur D. Gonzalez Martin, Brother Santodes, Carolina Klee, Lexi Delorme, Lord Tiebreaker, Michael and Katie Hake, Mr. A5013, Proscriptions of Dwojang, Psych XX, Slumbering Jellyfish, Observing Outer Space, Tesla Shark, Toa Michael, Vevictus, and Wesley, as well as all the other names here. I appreciate all their support. Also appreciate all of my people over on YouTube who are channel members. Yeah, you can become a channel member and get most of the same bonuses that you get from Patreon. You just don't get your names here. And you know what? Everybody who just watches my stuff, you're all great. I couldn't do this without you. Please rate this video, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. Check out my merchandise, which you can go down below and look at. And, all that other stuff I'm supposed to say here. Have a lovely day, and goodbye.